as one of the best economics commentators in the world. We're very fortunate that Professor Wolf has taken some of his time to talk with us on Learning Economics. So please make him welcome. And, Professor Wolf, you mentioned that you wanted to start off by answering some questions. So to kind of get the ball rolling, I've got one question for you. So you've got a very distinct voice in economic commentating. How did you discover that voice?
I'm not even aware that it's very distinct. It's doing something is completely different from watching somebody else do it. So I'm not going to make this apparent, but suppose you were Roger Federer. You probably just think you're playing tennis. That's, as far as you're concerned, you're playing tennis. Somebody else thinks it looks completely different. You're aware you play it rather better than other people because you seem to win matches. Economics isn't quite like that. But the point is you're just doing it. So I don't think of having a distinctive voice. I just think of having my voice. That is to say, I do the thing the way that seems natural to me. It's natural for two reasons, probably, or three. I write about things that interest me, within reason. I write about them in the way that is natural to me after my education, which is a long time ago, so it's all really completely just part of me now, and has been for decades. And I write about it in a way that fits what I'm interested in. So I tend to the view that if you're starting asking yourself what makes you distinctive, you've already lost the point. Pretty obvious if you're writing stuff. What you're trying to write is just write well for you. And you have to hope that when we write well for you, other people enjoy it or find it interesting or drives them crazy or whatever, anyway, interests them. One shouldn't focus on the style, I think. This is not there can be a bit of that, but we're not Picasso. We're not trying to invent a completely new style of writing every week or two. You're just trying to do it because that's the natural way for you to do it, and you hope it works. I think it's the only answer. Don't be too introspective about it. I should say, by the way, I don't usually use this professorship thing. I have an honorary professorship and a rather odd assortment of honorary doctorates, but I don't think of myself as either a professor or a doctor, though I did an MPhil degree at Oxford, but I never completed a PhD. Never seemed very much worthwhile since I never wanted to be an academic. I'm very happy to take any other question on anything within reason. I don't promise to answer it. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I guess, how did you get started into economics initially? Because I heard you studied classics.
Yes, well, were you in that other lecture, or did somebody tell you that? Yeah. The answer to that is very simple. As you probably work out from my biography, I'm quite a bit older than you are. And so when I when I was in English schools, as they were then, it's still a bit like this. Back when you were about 15 or 16, you were expected to specialize in a relatively small number of what we call A-levels. I think you have a different system, but some of you are probably familiar with it. Now, believe it or not, this was 1961. So it's a long time ago. And in England, as it was then, if you were in a rather good school, I was in a rather good school, and you were specializing at the age of 16, it was thought, this is a rather long way around, but we'll get there. It was thought there were only two respectable things for a moderately intelligent or reasonably intelligent person to do and specialize in. You could either do maths, physics, and chemistry, or you could do classics. Those were the two alternatives. Everything else was just for the birds. So, and this was a legacy, of course, of centuries of educational tradition, which really goes back, I'm sure you understand this, to the Renaissance in Europe. when the rediscovery of the classics, above all Greek, defined what it meant to be an educated human being. If you think about, I don't know whether any of these names mean anything. Somebody like Erasmus, look up Erasmus if you don't know who Erasmus was. He defined what it meant to be an educated human being. That tradition, which was rested on the idea, central, I'm taking too long on this, but central to the idea that the West had of itself until about 50, 60, 70 years ago, that it was built on the ancient world. It was built on Rome and Greece. That's where we started. So I'm pretty well the last generation of people for whom it was accepted that really being able to read and write Latin and Greek well defined you as an educated human being. So that's why I did that. And I did some very strange things. I could write Latin and Greek verse. Well, quite well, actually. And so I could read Greek, ancient Greek, quite fluently. So that's what I did. Then when I went to university, I went up to read Greats, which was the core course. Greats was the degree that people used to do if they wanted to go into the civil service in Britain. By the way, a lot of this tradition, these Oxford Greats tradition, classics, was I think a more or less conscious modelling of the British civil service on the Chinese tradition of the Confucian classics. Very similar sort of culture. Anyway, when I was in my end of my first year in Oxford, which is 1966, I decided I was really, really interested in politics. That was a very intensely political time in the 60s. You probably can think about the student revolutions that occurred at that time in the West, the protest movements in Europe. There was a lot of Marxism among students. I was really interested in politics. And I decided if I wanted to understand politics as we thought about it then, it's funny given where I ended up, one had to understand economics. Economics was clearly the discipline within which political debate was occurring. Remember, this was only 30 years after the Second World War. It was shortly after the Keynesian Revolution. Milton Friedman was beginning to become a significant figure, so there was the monetarist counter-revolution going on. Inflation was beginning to become a serious issue. So I thought I had to understand economics. So I asked them whether I could switch from classics to PPE, which I did after my first part of my degree. And I decided to see whether I could do economics because I knew my maths was fairly poor. So it meant a lot of work to catch up. And then it went well enough. I did well enough in the degree to do a graduate degree at MPhil, which was the best place in England then. And then I decided this economic stuff is quite interesting, and I ended up going to the World Bank and so forth. But that's basically how my very, very peculiar educational background occurred, and I think this would now be pretty well unimaginable. One of my sons, but he's a real eccentric, now classical musician, did do Greats, and his classics were better than mine. But basically, this is a subject that's largely disappeared. And one of the consequences of this, which for most of you here from Asian backgrounds won't mean anything, but that particular route of of Western civilization, namely the sense that it was came out of the ancient world, that there was a direct connection with the great classical writers and ourselves, is clearly something that we have now, for better or worse, completely lost. Any other questions? Yes, this young lady.
I know you predominantly do print journalism, but as a journalist, do you consider yourself as more a talker or a writer? And which one do you think is more powerful?
I'm clearly a writer. Most of what I do is, I do books as well, as many journalists do. I'm doing another one. I've done a couple of quite to me, significant books. Probably rather more academic than most journalists' books would be, absolutely stuffed with footnotes, for example, which most journalists wouldn't do. But print is what I do. It's my profession. It's what's permanent. It's where you can do it right. I mean, you can be much more precise than when you're speaking. But I do a lot of interviews. talking head stuff, as it were, for broadcast organizations around the world, including yesterday here, because they're always looking for people who can talk, who can appear on their shows. But I regard that as just sort of light entertainment. It's relatively simple. I have friends, very good friends, who've become broadcast journalists. For example, the economics editor of the BBC, a woman called Stephanie Flanders, worked for me. She worked at the FT. It's a very good friend of mine. Her predecessor is also a very good friend of mine. They're very good economists, I think. And the BBC does this stuff pretty well. But I always find, and I've done radio programs, I've never done TV programs. I've done a number of radio programs, World Service, BBC 4 sort of programs. The World Service ones are quite widely distributed. That's quite a lot of work, and it's quite interesting, but you can cover so much less ground than in print, and it's always woollier, and you always obviously know that people listening or watching aren't going to go back normally, so you have to get the points at once. Given the subjects I write about are relatively, not extremely, but relatively technical, it's quite difficult to do that well. So as I said, I basically tend to regard, for me, broadcasting as entertainment. But I wouldn't, I have nothing against it. Doing television economics on television well, is very, very hard. And getting the audience interested is very, very hard. And conveying ideas to this audience is very, very hard. And I admire people who do it, but it doesn't work for me.
Obviously, some of your audience includes some of the most powerful policymakers in the world. Do you ever address yourself directly to them through your column to try and influence that policy? Or is it more about the broader audience and educating them?
I've written a few columns, relatively small number, in the form of open letters to individuals. So it's obvious who you're addressing to. The most recent one was one I wrote, must have been now about 18 months ago, to Mario Draghi when he became governor of the ECB, telling him to do what he's just done. So I took 18 months, but he got there. He knew that. I mean, I knew that I was pushing on an open door. I'm not saying in any way that he did it because of me, certainly not. But yes, there are quite a few columns that I've written to. More normally, I've written towards a limited number of individuals because I'm trying to persuade them that certain things have to be done now. That is more common. Just sort of step back. I've done this particular. I've been a writer at the FT since '87, so it's 25 years. I've been a full-time columnist since '96. This is the end of my 17th year, so it's quite a lot of years. If I look back at the period that I've written the last 25 years, there tend to be periods of relative economic calm and periods of extreme crisis. They oscillate. We've been in a period of extreme crisis for the last 5 years. That's a very long crisis period. Extreme, considerable crisis, okay? When you're writing in a period of crisis, you're writing about the week's events often, and you're trying to usually find yourself, often writing yourself, to find yourself concluding that something needs to be done about this to, in your view, avoid making it worse or whatever, or to improve the situation. So crisis periods tend to, you always have explanation, you always have analysis, otherwise you're not, what you want to recommend isn't rooted in anything, but you're trying to persuade something to do something. In other periods, a lot of it can be quite analytical because there's no particular message you want to bring. And even when it's not analytical, I did a lot of stuff on climate change before the crisis, and I have a view on what should be done about that, but it's not really addressed to specific individuals, it's broader. So it tends to be about the topics. And there are times when I tend to write, I find, structural long-term subjects like aging, say, or technical change, or climate change, or things of that kind. And then there are other periods of crisis, and crisis tends to lead you to address really quite a small number of decision makers. In the area that I write about, in crisis, which is global macroeconomics and finance, the number of important policymakers is really remarkably small. I mean, really remarkably small. So in central banks, you're talking about a handful of people that matter in monetary policy in a crisis. In fiscal policy, it's a few more, but it's a bit more, depends on the country. So you do naturally tend to think about very specific individuals because there's just this handful of people who make those decisions, for better or worse. And if you're writing about those and you think that somebody has to do something, you have to address them. I read some other columns and blogs. That's a new thing, of course. Not new. I could read other columnists before, but it's much easier now, for example, to read columns produced in America or all over the world than it used to be for me. That wasn't true so much for New York Times columnists because they used to be in the International Herald Tribune, but for other newspapers, it's much easier now. And of course, the blogs are new. I mean, by new, I mean they're new for me. They're not new for you. They're new in the sense that 10 years ago, there weren't any that anyone cared about, roughly. No, they had no influence. They do now. I'll tell you in a moment who I most read. I try to avoid spending my life reading other columnists and bloggers, partly because you then just end up absorbing their views, and partly because I like also to read books and more substantial things. So I try to contain that. And with a lot of my writing, I write about a subject and I go back to the primary data or big reports. I read a lot of, obviously, the reports of international financial institutions like the IMF, which I wrote about this morning, and I read NBR working papers, National Bureau of Economic Research working papers, and similar working papers and research reports from organizations like Bruegel in Europe. I'm mainly working on the financial crisis, so it tends mostly to be advanced. I try to read a fair amount of non-academic research material and also academics doing that, rather than just reading columns and blogs. I think that's important, otherwise I'm not adding much value. So I follow the work. If I'm writing about India, for example, I would try and read out what the Indian economists I respect are writing. So I'd go and look at their contributions. I think that's very important for what I do. So I don't spend much time reading columns and blogs. I read Paul Krugman for obvious reasons. I think his position is well known. I agree with him on a lot of things, but he's certainly an incredibly good writer. There's no question he's an incredibly good writer. I read Brad DeLong occasionally. I read Greg Mankiw to have the other side. I think he's the most sensible on the center-right in the States. My former colleague, who's now moved across the Atlantic, used to be the Times economics columnist, Anatol Koletsky. I still read quite often. I read Eve Smith, which is Susan Weber. She uses this pseudonym, who writes a really quite important blog on the financial sector and what's going on in finance. And beyond that, the others I read very occasionally. I can give you a long list if they're writing on subjects I'm particularly interested in. Those are the people I read pretty regularly. But as I said, I think for me, it's important not to spend my time reading other people who do what I do, but reading people who are actually doing proper research, which I can use. As I said, the NBR working papers are probably the single most important source of economics and economic analysis for somebody like me. And then I read quite a lot of heterodox stuff. I read quite a lot of Minskian stuff. I mean, it depends on what I'm doing. I read Austrians when I feel they've got something interesting to say. I have no sense of influence. I don't even know what one means by that. If you start writing something and think, my God, this is going to change the world, you're on the journey to Bedlam. I think you're going to become a self-obsessed lunatic. So the right thing to do in this, and it's in anything, is to do it as well as you can and hope it works, that people are affected by it. So I don't think when I write about whether this will have influence, I hope it will. That's a different thing. What has happened in terms of my writing, I think, is looking at from outside, it's partly just about being around a long time. You become an institution. You know, everybody thinks there's this guy who's been writing for the FT since the dawn of civilization, as it were. But then I have a fellow columnist on the FT called Samuel Britton, who writes now once a fortnight. He's nearly 80. And he started doing this in 1960, so I'm a neophyte. I hardly started. Now, he really is an institution, though less globally influential. So being around makes a difference. And that's number one. The second thing is events. What's going on? Most of the time, it comes back to what I said about crises and normal periods. Most of the time, sensible, reasonable human beings who aren't very interested in economics don't pay any attention. The economy's working fine, life is okay. Economics seems rather arcane and remote and boring and done by a strange bunch of geekish people. So it just doesn't have much traction outside the limited world of finance specialists, central bankers, and so forth, who've always read me. But for them, so most of the time that I've been doing this, I've had a limited readership of obviously important and influential people doing something that most people in the world just don't think much about. They didn't think about central bankers much. You know, Mervyn King, for example, was not really a household word in Britain 8 years ago. I suspect, though I don't know, if you ask most British people who was the central bank governor in 2005, the Bank of England governor, they wouldn't know. They do now. Then you get a whacking great crisis in your country and in all the other countries that are like yours. This is the first time this has happened in my lifetime. In fact, it's the first time this has happened since the 30s, right? So I wrote an enormous amount about the Asian financial crisis. I was very proud of what I wrote at the time of the Asian financial crisis. I think it was some of the best writing I ever did. And it had some influence because people were aware that was an important crisis and there were people in Asia who read it. But of course, for most of my readers who are mostly in the West, it was something that happened somewhere else. So even that didn't have a big impact. But it certainly helped me to become, I think, more relevant in Asia. I wrote a lot on China, and my stuff on China has all been translated into Mandarin and published by our FT Chinese. We have a website. And over the years, I've become really rather well known in China because I'm one of the very few outside economists whose columns appear in Chinese every week. So a lot of Chinese people got to know me for that reason. That sort of built up over time. And they came to the conclusion, I think, that they didn't like what I said often, but that I seemed to know a little bit what I was talking about. So I wasn't one of these completely deranged anti-Chinese Westerners or anything like that. So that made me build up influence. And so what the Chinese authorities did after they realized this was going on, they started inviting me to things. They're very clever. And then, so that was China, who is more aware of this, I think, than any other major country. And then, of course, there's the big Western, the global financial crisis, as you call it. That, of course, has affected all Westerners. It's become every television program in Europe and North America since the crisis started has things about the crisis in various forms: banking, finance, central banks, interest rates, unconventional monetary policy, QE, all that. Every week it's daily news. So suddenly comes back to the question about TV. They need to put talking heads on the TV shows every other day. They have to have people who can explain this stuff, and everybody wants to read it. So the 5 years of the crisis has enormously increased the visibility of somebody like me. I'm on the television ludicrously large number of times and radio, and it's transformed sort of my life. And then businesses get very excited because they want to know what's going to happen to the economy, because they realize that the future of their business doesn't just depend on how well they're doing their business, but what's going on in the world. The events of 2008 and 9 in the United States and the UK, and then the Eurozone crisis, has really brought home to people in the way that I previously saw a bit in the 70s, the great inflationary period, and was clearly true in the 30s, that economics really matters. Well, if you live in a period when economics really matters, then that relatively small number of people who write stuff on contemporary economics, which is widely read and easily available on a paper like the FT, becomes very visible, and I become visible. So that's really what's driven it. It's just the events of the crises in general. And so I am afraid I sometimes say on this that the crises are very, very, very bad for the world, but they're very good for me.
So just to go back to the influence thing, which I know you're probably hating talking about, but do you think that you have more influence now as a writer and a journalist than you had when you were at the World Bank in terms of impacting the policy, or say you had another role in government where you could impact policy? And if I can ask the second one related to that, do you think that because so many journalists miss the triggers of the ESSA, apart from a few voices, that people are now more willing to listen to those few voices that might not have got attention before because they're a bit more nervous?
Well, there's no doubt at all that my role now has more influence in sort of an obvious way in shaping the debate than any other job I would normally do in a bureaucracy. That's one of the reasons I left the bank. I mean, I found it very frustrating to be in a bureaucracy. It's not me. I wanted an individual voice, so I didn't get there immediately. I didn't quite know how to do this. Because even now, I've been thinking about how this will change. I was discussing this over lunch. When I started doing this, and this is now, as I said, I was really started doing this in '96, there weren't blogs. There were a very, very small number of reputable newspapers that ran columns that were widely read in the world. The FT was one. The Economist was one, but of course they're unsigned. And the Wall Street Journal was one on the right, the New York Times. That was basically it. And that was a bottleneck. And of course, in that situation, you had a lot of influence because you were the individual voice of this institution. Today, I think I'm sort of benefit as a legacy of that because I became quite well known. Now, any academic who's worth anything, anybody who's worth anything, can create their own blog. And if they're any good, they will get quite a following. It will be, so the advantages of being a new FT columnist on this are going to be much smaller. There's still some, because FT has a brand value still, people still interested in reading it. But I think it's going to be much more democratic in future. So my rather unique position may be a historical legacy. It may be a consequence of a sort of economics of the media, which are now dead. And so it may be true, I don't know, that 20, 30 years from now, there won't be anybody like me, quite. Maybe even not 20, 30 years, and maybe my successor won't be like me. But I was very, very fortunate to start doing this at a time when being the economics columnist for the FT gave you a tremendous impact. We were becoming global at a time when it was still technically quite difficult to set up as a sort of global voice outside an organization like ours. But that's clearly not the situation now. It's clearly true that, on your second question, that there's more interest in the world outside, as you said, in the views of economists, and particularly in the views of economists who are thought to have had some clue about what was going on. I have to stress, I don't think anybody got it all, even Nouriel, and he was the closest. And I certainly didn't get the financial meltdown. I got some aspects of it, but not the financial meltdown. But there's clearly more acceptance of somewhat more heterodox views on finance and the market. And so the development of my views has had a certain amount of impact. But I don't regard myself, and it's one of my regrets, great regrets, as somebody who sat down in 2005 and said the whole Western financial system will melt down in total and we're going to be in a completely different world. Because I wrote some stuff in 2005, 6, 7, expressing some concern about where we were on this, but I certainly didn't expect that. What I did know is that the debt accumulations were unsustainable. It was clear that that was going to break, but it wasn't clear to me that this would end up with what has happened. So I don't regard myself as one of the great geniuses who foresaw this. But again, it comes back to the other question, as the sort of last point. We live in a world where everybody is aware that the economic financial forces are very, very important. They're changing the way the world works. So they look to people who they think might know a little bit more about this than they do. I hope I'm one of those, but actually I'm very, very clear about this, very, very clear about this. None of us really understands where this can go because the possibilities are so many. And anybody who tells you, when I do lectures on this, I say that anybody who tells you what's going to happen next is a fraud. That's pretty obvious, and I try to avoid that form of fraudulence as much as I possibly can. Anyway, that's the best answer I can give to you, those interesting questions. Somebody else?
What would be, what you'd recommend to us to improve the economic situation and just improve the world economy in general?
I think you have to decide, I've been discussing at lunch, what you want to do with your life. And there are many ways of leading a life, and they don't need all or even mostly to be in public affairs, broadly defined, in the way the world is organized. And I don't think there's anything wrong in not pursuing that sort of life. It's just, as I expressed earlier, that's what interests me. I think nowadays, economics is a very good start, though it's not enough. And one needs to understand a lot of other things to make a reasonable job of understanding what's going on in the world. I know it may sound very strange, but my classics has been fantastically useful to me. And I know it sounds very peculiar. I could explain, but I won't now. If somebody asks, I will. The politics. I studied politics as well. I did a degree in PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. The politics was very important. I was very well taught, and it made me think about the interaction between economics and politics, which has always interested me. And I did philosophy as well. I did all three, and I did a lot of philosophy when I did classics, and that helped me a great deal in clarifying issues in my mind and the whole range. So I do think it is important, to a starting point, to become as well educated as you can be, and that doesn't just mean economics, particularly modern economics, which tends to be a lot of it very arid and, in my view, very technical and mathematical, and that only gets you so far in the sort of subjects I'm interested in. I'm not in game theory or micro stuff. I have a brilliant colleague called Tim Harford, who's written some wonderful books. He's a magnificent economic journalist. I don't know whether you've read any of his books. I recommend them. But he focuses on game theory, micro stuff, and he's terrific. And it's not my interest, and it's much too difficult for me. So we specialize in different things, and that's a different area, and where more technical economics works better. In macro, I think it's different. You have to understand the history of economic thought, and you have to understand the economic history. I stress the history of economic thought and economic history. One of the most interesting things that happened in this crisis is we all went back and resurrected economics, which the academic community had basically buried, right? And I don't just mean Keynes, though Keynes is obviously an important part. The same was actually monetarism was buried. Milton Friedman had disappeared from the curricula. And so, of course, had all the Austrians. Now, if you go and look at the debate in the actual debate out there in the world on economics in the context of the crisis, it's essentially a debate between Keynesians, monetarists, and Austrians, none of whom are seriously represented in contemporary academic discourse. There are a whole range of reasons for that, but that's the reality. And if you don't understand what these people were writing about, why they were concerned about it, why those were the issues of the 1930s, you can't get very far, right? So I'd stress that. Now, once you've got all this in your brain, then you can start providing a useful contribution to the world. How you do that, there are many ways. You can become a writer, you can go into politics, you can go work in international organizations, you can write books, you can become a propagandist. You can there are many things you can do. You can organize things of various kinds. I think there are many ways to influence things. But at your age, on the assumption that you're under 25 and possibly even younger than that, the basic thing is to get this is the only time in your life that you're going to find it easy to get your brain full of useful, the basic stuff on which you will live for the rest of your life. You can constantly keep reading, thinking. If you don't do that, you're dead. You can't go on just with the ideas you started off with in your 20s, but this is the period when you've got to accumulate your stock of understanding of the world. And a lot of that, as I said, is to go beyond a particular narrow academic discipline at a particular time. My view has always been that economics is a social science. I stress social. It's not a lost branch of physics. And you have to understand these related disciplines: anthropology, politics, sociology, history, if you're going to make much sense of policy in the sorts of areas I deal with. As I said, it's different if you're doing the sort of thing that Tim Harford does. And then how you use it, everybody has to use it in a different way. That's what depends on what they're good at, what they're interested in. But the starting point is education. And it has to be quite broad. You have to understand this. And a lot of this was lost. I mean, I think a lot of the people who came out of doctoral programs in the last 20 years had actually no way even to think about the crisis, because there was nothing they were taught that would explain why it happened, why it might happen, and how it might work.
Do you believe in general there's a tendency in mainstream media to sensationalise issues at the expense of objectivity?
Yeah. Look, the media is a business, right? It's a business providing a public good. That creates some interesting questions. Obviously, information analysis is a public good. It has public good properties in many dimensions. I don't need to emphasize that. But it is a business, and it doesn't work if people aren't prepared to watch, read, pay, one way or another, for what it's provided. Now, of course, some media organizations are funded by taxes directly or indirectly, so they have a slightly different imperative. But even there, they're not going to continue to be supported by the public if none of them wants to watch anything they're doing or read anything they're doing. So you have to get people's attention, right? There are an enormous number of institutions and people trying to get people's attention, and right now we have a better machinery in terms of the internet and related developments for disseminating everybody screaming for attention than ever before. You know, it's one great scream, look at me, please. Now, in the old days, newspapers were local monopolies mostly. They really were local monopolies. They didn't have to scream. They didn't have to sensationalize, because no one had a choice. If you were in New York, you had to read the New York Times, because there wasn't any, except the Wall Street Journal, there weren't any other newspapers available. They could be relatively unsensational because they had a local monopoly. There are no local monopolies. We never really had one. So you're in the highly competitive world, increasingly competing with all these institutions and people screaming at you from all over the world in the English language is really bad, because there are so many places where English language publications, products are being produced. So you have to get people's attention. The way you do that is by making it sensational. Now, there is a difference, I think, between sensationalizing and lying one's head off, but the borderline is difficult to define. And of course, a lot of it becomes very partisan for the same reason. You want to attract people who automatically know that you are the right person for them because you're telling them what they want to hear. My view on that is get used to it. It's the way it's going to be. There's nothing we can do about it. It's tough, but that's how it is. And it obviously has a downside. Providing a crucial set of public goods through a competitive marketplace where information analysis is the public good, is almost certainly suboptimal, but I can't really think of a better one. I have become, this is a change. In the last 10 years, I have become much keener than I used to be on the tax-funded monopolies. I'm mainly concerned with the BBC because it's ours, and it's obviously a very famous institution. I think it performs a very valuable function in our public life, though it creates problems, which we couldn't replicate if it didn't exist through the market. The market can't do that. And I think that's one way of keeping other publications honest. Now, there are big problems of bias there too, but they're different. So I think the mixed economy model of information analysis provision is probably the optimum. I didn't think that 10 years ago when I was more confident that the market-led thing would work on its own. I think that there's been quite a wide range of economists who have tried to take on board what's happened in the crisis and to think about its implications. The ones who have impressed me most are actually the economists who specialize in finance. Obviously, a lot of them have been aware that the market has not ended up working quite as they expected. And if you read, particularly Americans, but also to some degree Europeans, Brits, the sort of post-crisis analyses by quite a wide range of high-quality academics and public and people working in official institutions on financial questions like how banks should be structured and organized, what capital they should have, what a role of a bank is, how you shift incentives for compensation and how they affect the way bank. I don't want to list all names, but there's been a fair amount of really quite good applied stuff, the Squam Lake books, the stuff coming up from NYU. So there's been quite a range. I'm quite impressed with the financial people. Whether we fixed all this, that's a different matter. But I think they really have been trying. Macro, I think, is in a much bigger mess because the canonical models we've been using, whether they are new classical or new Keynesian, are basically models that don't have finance in them. They don't have finance sectors in them, right? The models themselves don't, and the applied models don't. They don't know what to do with finance. Banking isn't inside them. Macro models, in my view, I've always felt this back since I read Keynes, macro models which don't have financial sectors in them are really sort of worthless. They don't explain what's going on. The problem is we don't know how to model this in the macro context. You generate all sorts of absolutely unintractable analytical structures when you throw this stuff in. All the representative agent rational expectations models are useless from this point of view. And I think there's a big debate out there about how macro should be done, whether it needs to be micro-funded, and how to make this work practically now. So what are central banks and IFIs doing nowadays? They're basically taking their old models and throwing in all sorts of spanners into them to make them sort of grind out results that look like the real world. But they're not rooted in anything that they deeply believe in. Take the IMF. Okay, the IMF is the most important macro official organization, clearly. It's the one big one. Now, they've got a very interesting result recently. They've just produced, it's very controversial, very interesting, completely renewed estimates of Keynesian multipliers, right, which change short-term multipliers on fiscal policy. But the Keynesian apparatus that they're basically using here was completely out of the whole academic macro discipline for 30, 40 years. So this is almost an exercise in economic archaeology. So I would say that I think I made this point earlier. When we hit the crisis, an event that shouldn't have happened, as it were, we suddenly found ourselves all going back to economists who'd been dead for decades. I mean, that's a very peculiar thing. Now, macroeconomists, I think, serious macroeconomists, don't know what to do about this. There are a few New Keynesians I think are trying, but there's some very big issues about that. So I tend to feel that the financial people are trying to grapple with what's going on, but the way we think about the economy as a whole and how it fits together, how it works during a breakdown period, how the various bits of it interact, I can't go further. The rigorous academic framework on the one hand and the heuristics of applied policy work on the other just don't really meet. And I think economists don't know what to do about this. Now, I've spent a lot of my summer thinking about this. I'm writing a book which will have a chapter on this subject. I don't think it's a simple answer, but I think that branch of economics is in pretty serious crisis, as it was in the 30s. It's essentially the same sort of crisis. The economic system in aggregate doesn't seem to work as if it were an aggregate of the so-called, the supposedly self-stabilizing micro markets that people are comfortable with. That's a pretty big analytical and intellectual problem. I don't know how that will be solved, but it won't be solved in my lifetime. Maybe you can solve it. Perhaps somebody there is in this audience who has already solved it and is about to write the Nobel Prize winning paper which will solve it. But that's clearly the challenge. Bob Lucas, who's certainly a genius, thought he'd solved this in a very specific way. He was certainly the most important macroeconomist of the last 40 years, but I think his solution was a cul-de-sac.